In 1988, a man named Charles Dowding walked onto a piece of land in Somerset, England, that everyone around him said was ruined. The soil was compacted clay. It had been sprayed with chemicals for decades. Previous owners had written it off as too difficult, too depleted, too far gone. Dowding looked at that same soil and saw something different. He did not plow it. He did not rent a tiller. He did not buy bags of synthetic fertilizer. Instead, he laid cardboard directly on top of the ground, covered it with a thin layer of compost, and planted into it the very same week. By that autumn, his ruined ground was producing more food per square foot than the conventionally tilled gardens of his neighbors who had been working their soil for years. By the following spring, the improvement was so dramatic that local farmers who visited thought he had trucked in different soil entirely. He had not. He had simply stopped fighting the ground and started working with what it already wanted to become. What Dowding discovered, and what he has spent the last 35 years refining, documenting, and teaching for free, is not a gardening method. It is a completely different relationship with the land beneath your feet. By the time you finish this video, you will understand why a single 4x8 raised bed, managed correctly, can produce more vegetables than a conventional garden 20 times its size. You will understand why most gardeners work 10 times harder than necessary and still get less food. And you will understand why the system that fixes all of this was buried under a century of advice that profits seed companies, fertilizer suppliers, and gardening equipment manufacturers, but quietly exhausts everyone who follows it. The knowledge is simple. The results are almost embarrassing once you see them. To understand why Dowding's method is so radical, you first have to understand what we replaced it with. For most of human agricultural history, soil was understood as a living thing. Medieval European peasant gardeners maintained what were called cottage gardens, intensively planted, deeply mulched, never tilled. Crops overlapped. As one plant finished, another was already waiting in the same ground. There was no empty soil, no bare beds, no gap between harvests. The garden was always in motion. Japanese farmers developed a nearly identical system called Fukuoka cultivation, described in detail by Masanobu Fukuoka in his 1975 book, The One Straw Revolution. His core principle: do not disturb what is already working. The soil organisms doing the hardest work, breaking down organic matter, cycling nutrients, building structure, are destroyed every time you dig. Every pass of the tiller is a massacre of the invisible workforce that makes growing possible. In 16th century England, the intensive kitchen garden, the potager, was standard practice for anyone who depended on food rather than grew it recreationally. Beds were permanent. Paths were permanent. Nothing was ever tilled. Manure and compost were laid on top and allowed to work their way down. Plantings were staggered so that as leeks came out in February, broad beans were already planted to take their place before the ground had time to grow a single weed. These systems fed populations for centuries with almost no external inputs. Then came the 20th century. The mechanization of agriculture introduced the plow and the tiller as universal solutions. What worked at industrial scale was applied wholesale to backyard gardens, and with it came an entire supporting industry: rotary tillers, synthetic fertilizers to replace the biology the tilling destroyed, pesticides to manage the pest pressure that bare disturbed soil invites, and a calendar-based approach to planting that meant most gardens sat completely empty for 4 to 6 months of every year. A generation of gardeners was taught to think in seasons rather than flows. You plant in spring, you harvest in summer. The garden is done by October. Dig it over in November. Start again next March. That model produces a fraction of what a well-managed bed can grow, and it requires constant work: tilling, fertilizing, pest management, watering, to produce even that fraction. Charles Dowding did not invent an alternative. He remembered one. Then he proved it. Bed by bed, season by season, with photographs and harvest weights going back decades, and put all of it online for anyone to find. The question worth asking is why no one told you about it sooner. The phrase "no-dig gardening" sounds passive, like you are simply doing less. That framing is the first misconception to correct. No dig is not about doing less. It is about letting the right things do the work. Component 1. The soil food web. What you stop destroying. 6 inches below the surface of any undisturbed soil, there is a civilization more complex than anything humans have built. A single teaspoon of healthy garden soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Fungi extend thread-like mycelium networks that connect plant roots across dozens of square feet, trading minerals for sugars. Bacteria break down organic matter into plant-available nutrients in a cycle that requires no intervention. Earthworms pull surface organic material downward, creating channels that allow water infiltration and root penetration without any mechanical help. Every time you till, you collapse that structure. The fungal networks are severed. The worm populations crash. The bacterial communities are exposed to UV light and die. The soil collapses into a fine powder that, when it rains, compacts into something closer to concrete than growing medium. Then you have to till again next season to break up the compaction created by last season's tilling. The first thing no dig does is stop this cycle. When you leave the soil structure intact, the organisms do the aeration, the nutrient cycling, and the water management for you. Your job is simply to feed them from the top. Component 2. Compost on top. The annual investment. The single input that makes no dig work is compost. Not dug in, not tilled under, laid on the surface in a layer roughly 1 inch deep, once or twice a year, and left there. This mimics exactly what happens on a forest floor. Leaves fall. Organic matter accumulates on the surface. Organisms from below pull it down. The soil builds from the top, and over time gets better, not worse. Dowding applies compost in autumn, and again sometimes in spring. On his market garden in Somerset, a site he has been farming for over 2 decades without tilling, the beds have gone from tired, depleted ground to some of the most biologically active soil in Britain, not from any dramatic intervention, from patience and compost. The financial arithmetic is straightforward. A single cubic yard of finished compost costs between $30 and $60, covers roughly 100 square feet to 1 inch depth, and replaces every synthetic fertilizer you would otherwise buy. Make your own from kitchen scraps and garden waste, and the cost drops to zero. Component 3. Permanent beds and paths. The structural decision. The single design choice that multiplies every other benefit of no dig is deciding once where you walk and where you grow, and never changing it. Conventional gardening treats the entire garden as growing space, which means it also becomes compaction space. Every step compresses the soil that plants need to root into. Dowding's beds are typically 4 feet wide, the maximum you can reach from both sides without stepping in. Paths run between them, permanently. Once laid with wood chips or gravel, they never move. The beds themselves are never stepped on. What this creates, within a single season, is a measurable difference between the beds and the paths. The path soil compacts. The bed soil remains loose, open, and biologically active. Roots penetrate deeper. Water infiltrates faster. Harvests are larger. A garden of 400 square feet, laid out in permanent beds with this system, reliably outproduces a conventionally managed garden of 1,000 square feet or more. That is not a marketing claim. It is a number Dowding has documented repeatedly with harvest weights, photographs, and 35 years of records. Here is where no dig becomes something beyond just better gardening. Most gardeners think in terms of crops. You plant tomatoes. You harvest tomatoes. The tomatoes finish. You think about what to plant next, usually too late, usually in the wrong place, usually with a gap of bare soil in between. Dowding thinks in terms of flows. Every space that is harvested has already been pre-planted with its successor. There is no gap. There is no empty ground. There is no moment when a bed is doing nothing. This is succession planting, and it is the mechanism that turns a small backyard into what Dowding calls a continuous harvest system. How it works in practice, lettuce is one of the fastest illustrations. A lettuce head is ready in roughly 6 to 8 weeks from transplant. Most gardeners plant 12 lettuce plants in April, harvest them all in June, and then wonder what to do with the empty space. Dowding plants 12 lettuces in April. He also starts the next 12 in modules on a windowsill in mid-May. By the time the April lettuces are harvested in early June, the May lettuces are ready to go directly into the same ground. 2 weeks after that transplant, he starts the third batch. The bed never sits empty. The harvest never stops. From one small bed, he pulls lettuce continuously from April through October. This stacking principle applies to every crop in the calendar. Broad beans finish in June. They come out. French beans, started in modules 3 weeks earlier, go straight in the same ground. Already warmed, already biologically active, already fertilized by the compost applied in autumn. The French beans finish in September. Into the same bed go overwintering onion sets or garlic, planted in October, that will be ready the following June. That is 3 productive uses of the same square footage in a single calendar year. Conventional gardening gets 1. The module tray, the secret tool. The mechanism that makes succession planting logistically possible is the module tray. Dowding starts almost nothing directly in the ground. Instead, he sows into small plastic module trays indoors or in a cold frame, where seeds germinate in controlled conditions, develop a root system, and grow on until they are 4 to 6 weeks old and fully ready to establish outdoors. This approach eliminates 2 of the biggest failure points in conventional gardening: slug and snail damage to seedlings, which cannot damage a plant that is already past the vulnerable stage when it goes outside, and the dead time between clearing one crop and establishing the next. While one crop is still in the ground, finishing its last 2 weeks of growth, the next crop is already growing in trays, healthy and waiting. The moment the first crop comes out, the second goes straight in. The changeover takes an afternoon. Dowding has calculated that growing in modules and transplanting adds roughly 4 to 6 weeks of extra growing time per crop per year. Across a full season with 4 or 5 crop rotations on the same bed, this compounds into an extraordinary difference in total harvest weight. Interplanting, using vertical and temporal space. Together, alongside succession, Dowding uses interplanting to stack harvests within the same time window, not just sequentially. Lettuce grows happily beneath the canopy of tomato plants, occupying the ground level space that would otherwise grow weeds. By the time the tomatoes shade out the lettuce in midsummer, the lettuce has already been harvested 3 times, and the space under the tomatoes is used for something else. Radishes mature in 25 days. They can be planted and harvested in the time between transplanting a brassica and that brassica needing the full space. The radishes break up the soil surface slightly, mark the row for easier weeding, and add to your harvest count without taking a single square foot of productive capacity from the main crop. Spring onions can be grown in the gaps between slow-maturing leeks. The onions are pulled by the time the leeks need the space. The ground feeds 2 crops from one planting. Every square foot, in every week of the season, is producing something. That is the endless harvest, not a metaphor. A practical result of stacking time and space with more care than most gardeners have been taught. Here's the reality of starting this system, without the mythology. What you need for a family-scale setup capable of providing meaningful weekly harvests across 9 or 10 months of the year, you are looking at somewhere between 200 and 400 square feet of growing space. That is 2 to 4 standard raised beds, or the equivalent in ground-level permanent beds. The startup cost is almost entirely compost and cardboard. Cardboard is free. Appliance stores will give it away. Moving companies have excess. It is the first layer of your no-dig setup, laid directly over grass or weeds, overlapping at the edges so nothing grows through the seams. It smothers what is underneath without chemicals, breaks down within a season, and feeds the soil organisms as it does. On top of the cardboard goes compost. Budget $60 to $120 for enough to cover your initial beds to 3 to 4 inches depth in the first year, deeper than the ongoing annual top dress, because you are establishing from scratch. If you can make your own or source it locally free, the cost is $0. Module trays cost about $15 and last for years. A bag of seed compost for starting runs, $12 to $20, and seeds another entire season. A packet of lettuce seeds contains enough for more lettuce than a family of 4 can eat all summer. It costs about $3. Total startup investment for a functional system capable of changing how your household eats. Under $200 in most cases, often far less. The first season, step by step. In late winter, February or March depending on your climate, lay cardboard over the area you have chosen. Overlap the pieces generously. Wet it down so it lies flat and begins making contact with the soil underneath. Apply compost on top, 3 to 4 inches. This is your first and most substantial compost application. It is the investment that feeds everything that follows. Mark your beds and paths, 4 feet wide, with 18-inch paths between them. Drive in corner stakes if it helps visualize. Once set, these do not move. Do not wait for perfect weather. Start module trays on a windowsill in late February. Lettuce, chard, and spinach tolerate cold and can go outside under fleece from late March. Peas and broad beans can go in early. By the time your beds are ready, 2 to 3 weeks after laying the cardboard, you already have transplants waiting. Plant into the compost layer directly. No need to dig holes. Make a small depression with your finger or a dibber. Set the transplant. Firm, gently. Water in. That is it. Within 4 weeks, the cardboard below will have killed everything underneath it. The worms will have begun pulling organic material down from the compost above. The soil structure, undisturbed, will be softening and opening. By June, beds that were lawn or compacted soil in March will be producing harvests. What ongoing management looks like. After establishment, a no-dig garden managed with succession planting takes between 30 minutes and 2 hours per week for a 300 square foot setup during peak season. Most of that is harvesting. Weeding drops dramatically after the first season. The cardboard layer killed the weed seed bank in the surface soil. The compost applied on top is compost, not topsoil with weed seeds in it. Weeds that do appear are shallow-rooted and come out easily because the soil structure beneath them is loose and open. There is no tilling. There is no chemical spraying. There is no complex feeding schedule. Compost in autumn, compost optionally in spring, and the system manages itself. Dowding's actual market garden, which supplies weekly vegetable boxes to paying customers year-round, is managed by 1 person and 1 part-time helper. It produces more per square foot than farms 10 times its size because the system is doing the work that most farmers pay machinery, fuel, and labor to do. Realistic expectations matter. Here is what the first 3 years actually look like. Year 1. The harvest will be good, not extraordinary. You are establishing the system. The soil biology is rebuilding. Your succession timing will be imperfect. Most people start too few successions in year 1 because the rhythm is unfamiliar. You will have gaps. You will have moments where one crop finishes before the next is ready. That is normal and expected. What you will notice, weeding is less than you anticipated. Your plants establish faster than anything you have grown conventionally. The food tastes different, richer, more intense, because undisturbed soil produces plants with access to a broader mineral profile than depleted tilled ground. By autumn of year 1, you will harvest enough to feel the difference in your grocery spending. You will also understand the succession timing well enough to run it more tightly next year. Year 2. The soil has had a full season of undisturbed life. The worm population has increased measurably. The fungal networks have begun re-establishing. Compost from the first layer has been incorporated by the soil organisms, and your second autumn application is going onto ground that is genuinely better than what you started with. Succession timing in year 2 clicks into place. You have a felt sense for when to start the next module tray. Harvests are continuous rather than sporadic. Your household stops buying certain things at the supermarket, lettuce, salad greens, herbs, because there is always something ready outside. Year 3 and beyond. By year 3, Dowding's system has reached what he calls its productive cruising altitude. The soil is doing what it was always capable of doing when humans stop interfering. The harvest calendar covers 10 or 11 months of the year in most temperate climates. The input cost is a small amount of compost, a small amount of seed, and the time to transplant and harvest. Neighbors will ask what you are doing differently. You will have trouble explaining it because the explanation sounds too simple. Stop digging, stack your crops, feed the soil from the top, and let it do the rest. The system runs itself. You run alongside it. Harvesting. There is a number that Dowding publishes from his market garden that tends to stop people when they first encounter it. From a growing area of roughly 500 square feet, the size of a modest suburban backyard, his documented harvests regularly exceed 100 pounds of food per month during peak season. Not per year, per month. Across a full year, his production from a small plot consistently exceeds the annual vegetable consumption of 2 to 3 adults. And his harvests have improved every single year since he stopped tilling, because the soil is better every year than it was the year before. This is what most people have never been told about the relationship between soil health and food production. It is not static. A tilled, chemical-dependent garden gets worse over time, requiring more inputs to maintain declining yields. An undisturbed, composted, biologically active garden gets better over time, requiring fewer inputs to achieve rising yields. The curves run in opposite directions, and in 10 years, those curves are nowhere near each other. There is something else Dowding talks about less directly, but that anyone who has run this system for a few years understands viscerally. It is the feeling of walking out into your garden on a Wednesday evening in November, when the grocery store shelves are thin, when food costs feel unreasonable, when supply chains are a topic of daily news, and cutting fresh leeks and late kale for dinner, not from a stockpile, from living plants that will keep producing for another 3 months. That is not food security as a concept. It is food security as a daily, physical, immediate reality. The financial savings are real, but secondary. In most climates, a well-managed 300 square foot no-dig garden with proper succession planting reduces a household's vegetable spend by $800 to $1,500 per year within the first 2 years. By year 5, as the soil improves and succession timing becomes second nature, the production often exceeds what the household can eat. But the deeper value is something that does not show up in a spreadsheet. It is the quiet certainty of knowing that whatever happens outside your fence, something is growing inside it. That the ground beneath your feet is getting richer, not poorer. That the system you have built is not dependent on a supply chain, a delivery schedule, a price at a checkout, or anyone's decision but your own. Charles Dowding has been gardening the same ground for over 3 decades without ever tilling it once. The soil there now is darker, richer, and more alive than anything around it. That is not a coincidence. It is the result of understanding one principle that most modern gardening forgot. The soil is not a substrate you manage. It is a living system you partner with. Stop digging, stack your harvests, feed the surface, and let the depth take care of itself. The endless harvest is not a promise. It is what happens when you get out of the way and let the biology do what it has always done. If this changes something in how you see that patch of ground behind your house, if you can picture it in 3 years, producing food in November, while the rest of the neighborhood is buying imported lettuce at 3 times the normal price, subscribe so you do not miss the next system we uncover. Share this with someone who has been told their soil is too poor, too compacted, or too far gone to grow anything worth eating. It is not. It is just waiting for someone to stop fighting it. The ground is ready. The knowledge is here. The only thing standing between you and an endless harvest is the decision to lay down some cardboard.